Okay, so there are three main types of frame rates that are the most common that you probably use for videos like this, and that is 24 frames per second, 30, and 60 if you're using the NTSC platform. But the real question is, which one should you be using for YouTube videos? Alright, let's talk about it. So right now you're watching 24 frames per second, so this whole video is 24 frames per second, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to use it unless you really want to. But I'm going to tell you why I use this frame rate and why you might want to use it and why you actually might not want to use it. Let's talk about that. So like I said, this video is 24 frames per second, and the reason I actually use it is because personally I think it's a little bit more cinematic. It gives it a little bit more natural look. I don't know if our eyes necessarily see 24 frames per second because we don't see in frames, but when you wave your hand in front of your face, you'll see motion blur, you'll see motion, and you'll see the blur. And with 30 frames per second, it starts to look more like a TV show or the news broadcast or something like that. So 24 frames per second is what you'll see in blockbusters and Hollywood movies. That's the frame rate they use because it's the most realistic to what our eyes would see. I don't know if that's 1000% true, but it is one of the big reasons that a lot of people like to use that 24 frames per second, because it looks the most cinematic. But obviously, if you're not doing anything cinematic and you're doing just, anything else, you'll probably just be using 30. 30 frames per second is the most common in something like a news broadcast or just in any ordinary video, challenge video, that kind of thing. Bigger YouTubers, people like Mr. Beast and people like that, they'll probably be using 30 frames per second because every camera has 30 frames per second, but not every camera has 24 Canon. But for the most part, if you're not doing anything really cinematic, there's no reason really to use 24 other than it might have a little bit more natural motion blur. But again, no one's really going to tell the difference unless you actually are unless you have two videos side by side on a screen. But I can't really show you what 30 frames per second looks like or 60 because this whole timeline is going to be 24 frames per second. But if I raised up to 30 frames per second, this would look like basically the same. So then why might you want to be using 60 frames per second? Because if you've seen a lot of YouTube videos, you probably noticed that a lot of them either look super smooth and a lot of them just look natural. So 60 frames per second is most commonly seen in slow motion, because if you are editing on a 24 frames per second timeline, then if you slow down your footage 40%, then your footage is going to look slowed down, aka slow motion. But then why do people shoot 60 frames per second? So then why do people shoot in 60 frames per second and then don't slow it down? Usually, honestly, it's because they don't really know a whole lot about cameras. If you see a lot of YouTube channels that have nothing to do with cameras or technology or anything really that professional, then usually it's going to be in 60 frames per second due to the fact that they just think that that is higher quality, which in some cases is actually lower quality. Even though it still is 1080p, the camera is using more power to get that higher frame rate. So in some cases, the resolution still technically is 1080p, but it doesn't look as good. Like when you see 1080p from a super high-end cinema camera, it looks way better than the 1080p out of your iPhone, and that's just due to the fact that it's still 1080p, just a different type of 1080p, if that makes any sense. So then the question is still out there, what frame rate should you be using, 24 or 30? And in almost every case, I would say go for 24. But if your camera does not have 24, and you still want that 24 look, do not shoot in 30 and then upload your video in 24, because you're gonna basically lose frames and it's all gonna be plucked out and it's not gonna look good. So do not use that. Instead, just use a 30 frames per second. But in almost every case, I'd say go for 24. It looks more professional. That's why I use it. It looks more natural. And so I'd say 24 is probably the best, and probably if I only had one frame rate I could ever use, it would be 24. So yeah, if you have a 30 frames per second image and then you pluck out images and make it look like a 24 frames per second video, it's gonna be super jumpy, and then it's just not gonna look as good, because video is basically just a ton of images that you're seeing so fast that it looks like you're actually seeing something like real life. So that's why if you ever use those flip books, it basically is like that, where you have a stick figure and their hand is moving, but you're flipping it so fast it looks like it's actually moving, but there's nothing moving. You're just, changing the position of the arm. So basically you're seeing a ton of photos right now. You're seeing 24 photos per second to all combine together to make it look like an actual video. So yeah, if none of this is making sense and you don't know what NTSC is, or PAL standards, or what all these frame rates even do, or what it is, then go into Google or Safari and just search up NTSC or PAL or frame rates. There's a lot of people who do videos about frame rates. I just wanted to tell you, if you know about frame rates, which one you should be using. So yeah, if you find any of this helpful, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment down below what frame rate you are using. And that's pretty much it for this video, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Oh shoot, spider web all over the LCD screen. That's good.